Dying at 30 was natural. Not having vaccines was natural. Babies dying premature was natural. If that was natural and we fixed it, why can we actually work on things that impact our health? Women are living now longer than men. So that means that over a third of their life is postmenopausal. And that's compromised health of state for a lot of them.
Karl, how's the summer going for you?
I know it's not officially summer yet. We're still in May, but it does kind of feel like we've kicked it off.
Well, Memorial Day is the unofficial kickoff of summer.
It is the unofficial kickoff. And what do you do for Memorial Day?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I did the typical stuff, went to the beach. We're lucky to be in Brooklyn because we have access to so many experiences. So took the Q train to Coney Island and then walked along the Coney Island boardwalk to Brighton Beach. And we brought some of our gear. I like to have a tent, those beach tents that are like very lightweight and they're foldable. So it's a fun experience. And then hung out with some friends. A friend had a barbecue. It was downpouring during Memorial Day. So luckily they had an enclosed area where they could grill. So we were able to enjoy some hamburgers and hot dogs and hang out with our friends. So it was great summertime. What about you? What did you get up to?
So we actually drove up to the Adirondacks to Scroon Lake. Our cabin is in an association where you've got about 20 cabins. And so they always do an association meeting the weekend of Memorial Day. So there's a lot of activity. People are up there opening their cabins. You have a meeting to talk about the business of the association. We went up and we opened up our cabin and it was beautiful weather. We really lucked out. Kristen and I did a hike on Sunday. There's a hike nearby. It's super, super steep. You go up to a pond and then you can go around the pond and just kind of hang out there for a couple of hours. Very different from the hikes that we took in the desert a few weeks ago, which I just posted on LinkedIn a little bit about what those hikes were like and the reminders at the trailheads that say, do not die today.
Yes, that's very important advice, everybody. Do not die today. All right, keep that in your mind. It's a PSA, public service announcement. Please stay alive. Thank you.
And the context is when you're hiking in the desert, it does get very hot and you're supposed to be prepared. You're not supposed to hike between 11 and 4. We were there before that hot weather was there. I think the first day we hiked, I kind of felt like, oh yeah, it's pretty warm today. But it wasn't the way it's going to be in a few months or even a few weeks where it's basically going to be unwalkable. But the warning is for people who don't take it very seriously. And you could see a lot of people that are on the trail that are not dressed really appropriately for hiking in the desert. But you also did something interesting last week. You went to the Brooklyn Museum of Art for a gala. What was that about?
Yeah, there was a gala hosted by an organization called Plates of Change. And their whole mission is to provide resources to people that might be struggling financially, that might experience homelessness and need to get back on track. Something happened with some finances. They shared stories of the people that they support. And it was a woman with 2 children. She works for New York City, but wasn't making enough and needed some support. I just appreciated the fact that this organization is helping people locally. Some organizations are just global and you're like, okay, it's far from where I am, but these are our neighbors. So we got together. There's a lot of restaurants represented because in Brooklyn, there's like 50 restaurants on a block on certain streets. There were about maybe 15, 20 restaurants that were handing out different foods and everyone was dressed up and it was a great time, but it is gala season. So that was at the Brooklyn Museum. Brooklyn Children's Museum's gala's coming up, which we're of course fans of because I have a toddler. Our friends have kids that are younger and there's always wonderful activities that are happening. A friend of mine's on the board of the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And it is actually the first children's museum in the United States. It draws a great crowd. Brooklyn is still very culturally significant. A lot of shows and movies present Brooklyn. Is it a cool vibe, hipster vibe, urban city, kind of off city, I would say, because it's not necessarily a city, not compared to Manhattan. There's like a couple of other ones that I'll be going to. And I think it's a reflection of me being a part of the Brooklyn community for 9, 10 years. And you've been in the Brooklyn community for what, like 20 years?
A little bit more. It's interesting that you say that about Brooklyn being represented in the media, because this weekend, a movie that takes place in Brooklyn won the Cannes Palme d'Or, a movie called Enora, which is apparently about a woman who gets involved with the Russian mafia and oligarchs that happen to be here in Brooklyn. So a different side of Brooklyn.
Yeah, I saw a little bit of that at Brighton Beach, you know?
Yeah.
with all their Russian, Eastern European, Uzbeki influence. And they have these very grand restaurants with like chandeliers and just caviar spilling in the streets, which I actually picked up some caviar, by the way. So just to show off how fancy I am.
So we're going to do a shout out to our friend, Seth Yakatan. Seth has been texting us. Seth, who has been listening to our podcast a lot, and usually he told me he listens to it while he's on his treadmill. He's our number one fan, and we just want to let people know that they should follow him on LinkedIn. We'll leave a link to his post. Seth posts almost every day, mostly about cannabis, but also about raising money and biotech. It's a great person to follow and learn from.
Should we read some of his texts?
Yeah, I don't know. Read it, and then we may have to edit it out.
Okay, so it was crazy because it was one evening and my phone was just going bing, 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 bing. I'm like, what are all these texts? Is something going up? And then Seth's like, your meeting recaps are awesome. I've been listening and I just love your show. The AI and biotech space is something you guys really need to lean into harder, and the psychedelics as well. Your networking episode was a master class. There's a lot of capitalization that Seth does when he's very excited and lots of exclamation points and XOXO. So right back at you, Seth. XOXO. Thank you so much for the kind words. And we're big fans of you. Anytime Seth posts something on LinkedIn, I'm just like, wow, I really wish I got this piece of advice or this insight when I started a company, because it would have saved me some heartache. So if anyone's starting a company, please follow Seth, because you'll be in good company and you'll get the best advice.
So Seth said that we should lean into more on the AI and biotech, and we have had a couple of episodes on that. But you've been talking about quantum computing and its impact on biotech. I feel like I'm still learning. What brought it to your attention?
Yeah, I mean, quantum computing I've been interested in for quite some time. Over 10 years ago, I was working with a startup where we were making carbon nanomaterials, and there's a lot of applications in nanomaterials or wires. For quantum computing, you do need to operate on that level. And I mean, of course, even today's transistors, you have to operate on a nano level. But there's a lot of comparison. I think it's helpful to think about. Current computers, the transistors are 50 nanometers wide. And Apple created one that's 5 nanometers wide, which is a great feat. I don't think that's pervasive in all devices, but they were able to make one. So 5 nanometers means that it's 10 atoms across. So very, very atomic level work that we're trying to control and leverage. But a quantum transistor would be just 1 atom long, and you're able to operate on that level. And the comparison from today's computers to quantum computers is that today's computers, the transistor's output is either a 1 or a 0. But a quantum computer, the output would be a 1 and a 0 at the same time and everything in between. It computes multiple states simultaneously. And a great way to be introduced to quantum computing or just learn about the applications, and we're going to talk about that, of course, it's a recent Star Talk episode. It's a live episode where it's Neil deGrasse Tyson, Michio Kaku, Jordan Klepper from The Daily Show, and Tiffany Haddish, comedian, actress. Such a great episode.
It's hilarious.
It's hilarious. It's so funny, but it's so eye-opening and revelatory where you're like, oh, shoot, let's get on this quantum train. Michio Kaku released a book called Quantum Dominance and the influence and the competition to make quantum computers. It's one of the big applications that he was talking about and that was being talked about at SynBioBeta and some recent events that we went to. Biology does stem from quantum effects. Photosynthesis is a quantum process. So if we were able to have computers help us model some biological processes, what are we going to learn? The world's going to be very different soon. And I know it's different every day. We're living in a world where the rate of change is faster, I would say. So I'm just very excited about what's to come. And I'm sure there are people in our network that are looking at quantum computing and how it applies to their field and their discipline. And we should definitely have someone come on. I mentioned Drew Barry. He did a great presentation at SynBioBeta where he had this simulation going from the skin all the way down to the cellular DNA level and was showing a simulation. And they were just sparks going off at one point. And he's like, those sparks is actually a quantum effect. he's like, that's where my simulation stops. But we'll have to have him on and talk about what else has he observed when he's been doing these simulations.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because once you start getting down to that quantum level, the way I think about it, and Michio Kaku talks about the macro world being ruled according to the laws of Newtonian physics, but the quantum world being ruled by quantum mechanics. Is something solid? Is it a wave? That kind of stuff. The way biology operates, biology is nanotechnology that actually works, and it works at that atomic level. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see how quantum computing is applied to biotech, just in terms of expanding our knowledge of the way biology works.
Yeah.
So I super enjoyed that episode of Star Talk. I don't usually listen to it unless you tell me to listen to it. And that was one where I was like, you know what, I should start listening to Star Talk a little bit more frequently.
Yeah, right after that episode, Star Talk had a guest on, and she was from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. And she is talking about, well, there's pharma, but then there's what's going on in the world of vitamins and minerals and food, and talking about that in regards to our healthcare. They talk a lot about biology on Star Talk, so definitely worth listening to. But you guys are in a good place because Grow Everything also covers some of that stuff. So, and I want to talk about astrophysics sometimes too, because if we want to go back to the quantum side, understanding how quantum effects can open up all sorts of interesting things like ideas of wormholes and parallel worlds. And that's very fascinating. And those things are theorized and calculated, but to be able to observe anything like that is boggling my mind right now. I'll bring it back down to earth in today's moment and this universe. Star Talk is wonderful because they have a great community that surrounds it. And it's a community that we would love to foster as well. I am a Patreon of Star Talk because I really believe in all the work they do. I love Neil deGrasse Tyson. I love what they're doing. And I'd love to participate in that community. So we're offering that same opportunity for all of our listeners to become a Patreon. You will be in the inner circle of Grow Everything and Karl and Erum and all of our friends.
Beyond what we do in Brooklyn for our community.
Yeah, beyond what we do in Brooklyn, beyond what we do on the pod. But we would love for you to be a Patreon, get in the inner circle. So definitely sign up. And we want to give a shout out to our current Patreon members. I'll point out two of them. One being Beth Tuck, who was the executive director of GenSpace for quite some time. And thank you, Beth. We love you. We had Beth on the Grow Everything podcast early days, so definitely check out her episode. And another thank you to Tom Baruch, who you know very well.
Tom's a longtime Silicon Valley investor, was also a very early investor in biotech. A very interesting guy. So thank you, Tom, for supporting us.
Today's guest is also a community leader by the way of health tech and entrepreneurship, and approaching it from a different light, which now I think we should consider for Grow Everything, but approaching it from the way of the DAO, not DAO as in terms of the religious experience, but DAO as in Decentralized Autonomous Organization. Today's guest is Laura Minquini of AthenaDAO, where they're focusing on women's health and approaching it from multiple levels, but organizing it within this structure, which we're big fans of. We had Valley DAO on the episode. Karl, you interviewed Ari Lippman of LabDAO, Jocelyn Pearl, who also is a part of LabDAO. And we're going to have another person who's a leader in the DeSci community in a future episode. But Laura Minquini has been amazing. I met her at SynBioBeta last year. It's just wonderful to see how she's approached women's health, which has been significantly underfunded. And women are half the population. We all come from women. Things should be done more for women, I think. And the way that she's been approaching it, her priorities or their team's priorities and focusing on which working groups is fascinating. And we shall let Laura Minquini take it away. Laura Minquini, it's so wonderful to have you on the Grow Everything podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Yeah, we started our conversation at SynBioBeta last year. I remember you were sitting at a table in the expo hall and you were talking about DeSci and specifically AthenaDAO. You shared an awesome sticker with me, which I have somewhere on one of my books. And I was just fascinated about your approach to women's health and funding research. You also representing other organizations. And I know that you're a founder of a longevity organization as well. But before we get into all of that, we would love to learn a little bit more about you and how your career has evolved and brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, so I want to start by something that I always mention when I do presentations is that I'm not a scientist. I want to make that very clear.
Nice.
I love science, I love scientists, and I love working now in a field where I support their work. But I started my career in something completely different in fashion luxury. I was a fashion editor. Then I was a trend forecaster. I was doing go-to-market strategies and branding for luxury groups like LVMH when I was living in Paris. And from there, I had what I call my MBA in business, which was launching a company. We were the first to do license accessories for Apple products. When I say license, we've had design and fashion brands. We made cases and cables for Pantone, which some people might know. We did a lot of the collaborations for Selfridges, Lane Crawford, all these major stores, as well as we're distributed in the Apple store. That was a really great time in learning how to do distribution, manufacturing, marketing, the entire gamut. However, after about 8 years, it was getting very commoditized. I also didn't think that that's what I wanted my life to be, selling these things that are going to end up in landfills. I wanted something meaningful in my next stage of my career. By pure fluke, I volunteer my dog to retirement homes and hospitals, and I get shocked to the core because you hear of innovation all the time, like AI, synthetic biology, all of these things, and yet we're aging the same way or worse than probably 50 years ago. And I say worse because before people were aging at home with their families. And now the new system is in the Western world putting our elders in these homes. That shocked me. I did a market study. I wanted to get into the age tech space. To me, that was the status quo. And I discovered longevity biotech. And that's how I started my journey into this world. I was very curious about regeneration, rejuvenation. I think that is the most important thing that we can do for our aging demographic right now. Really tackle those areas of biology that will keep us living longer with health. From there, it's how I discover DeSci, the first BioDAO, VitaDAO, which is the first one that launched about 3 years ago, just at the tip end of the pandemic. They had the god of longevity at the time, Aubrey the Grey, and the god of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, do their YouTube launch. I remember that. I became a contributor. I was more in the communication side because I had grown a community with my Ikigai, which you mentioned about my longevity journey. And my focus was in trying to get the regular everyday person to understand the potential of the science. So the communication side of things. The only thing I noticed is that it was very hard to get projects in reproductive longevity ahead in VitaDAO. And I'm like, well, let's just do this ourselves. And that's the inception of AthenaDAO. The first DeSci conference happened in Berlin in May 2022. I met other amazing women that were like, yeah, we'd love to do this too. So by August 2022, we formed AthenaDAO. And our focus is on women's health. But we started with reproductive longevity because we know that side of things. And the way we tackle the issue of women's health funding is by focusing on different areas of research at different points and trying to obviously get translational science funded. But I can tell you more about that after we get more in depth. But my journey is tied to my understanding the consumer side of things. I know how powerful the female consumer is. I know that 80% of the consumer decisions in the world, in North America and the West, are made by women. And I know that a woman, if she wants something, she'll spend $50,000 in a bag. So it's there. To me, that we haven't paid attention to women's health issues is like, you know, that emoji with the brain exploding? That's like my brain when I think of how ignored by government, biopharma, everything women's health has been, because they would be your best clients.
Yeah, that is amazing. So I was hoping that maybe you could just step back for listeners who don't understand what DeSci is or what DAOs are, and then give us what the formation of AthenaDAO looked like.
So decentralized science is a new vertical in the Web3 crypto world that takes inspiration from decentralized finance. Decentralized finance was the notion that you could bank the unbanked, as well as some things with privacy concerns, people having self-ownership and being custodial about their assets. There's a long history of that already in the past decade. And I think people, when they see in the mainstream crypto or Web3, they think what the newspapers show them sometimes, or TV shows, that it's only scammers. And obviously what's promoted sometimes that it's people trying to launder money and all of these things. No, A lot of it had to do with even getting people that don't have bank accounts, a way to transact. The other part is people that want to make sure that they have an opportunity in a new asset class, which now in the US is very restricted. So making money for society has become much harder. And crypto was a way to try to change the dynamic. So decentralized science is trying to tackle the problems of science. And there are various verticals. We work on the funding part. We're BioTech DAO, which is trying to fund areas of research that are overlooked. But there's other verticals in problems in science. Publishing is a huge thing. Reproducibility is a huge thing. And publishing, for instance, people need to understand that scientists have to spend a lot of money to get published. If their paper makes it, it's still $5,000, $10,000. The people that review the papers don't get anything. And the publishing house still charges you to be able to read the papers. So $1 billion industry that is pretty much financed by taxpayers' money because the researchers are getting their labs paid by government money or like institutional money is then restricted for everyday layperson to read. Funding is a huge thing for some areas of science. And the Biotech DAOs, a decentralized autonomous organization, it's a formation of people that come together, different stakeholders, to try to bring a mission forward. The organization is supposed to be less hierarchical and more flat, in which different working groups have different operations, and people try to come together from different aspects to actually move a mission forward. AthenaDAO is one of those organizations, and our vertical in the decentralized science space is funding, and specifically funding for women's health research. When we came together, it was 2 entrepreneurs and 2 scientists, and then a bunch of other people that were interested in women's health. I guess the formation is pretty much putting a mandate, deciding how to do it, organizing the working groups, trying to go recruit. We have a token, which is one of the things that it's interesting in this space because it creates new incentives. And the incentives are supposed to help people be onboarded to your mission. So everybody in the DAO that wasn't getting paid right away anything, they were quote unquote accumulating tokens or working groups. A lot of people are still rewarded by those. The token has an intrinsic value because of an auction that happened. It's almost like crowdfunding, but on the blockchain. And why I think it's a very interesting connotation is because women, when they understand that the reason they go to a doctor and the doctor says to them, it's just your hormones, you're just a woman, don't worry, you can take pain. It's because they don't know why those things are happening to women. And why don't they know? Because we haven't researched it. So imagine a woman saying, instead of buying $100 of a supplement that is just a supplement, what if I buy $100 with ATH, or AthenaDAO has a product that most of the proceeds go actually to funding science? Making that connection, I think, is going to be very powerful as we grow and we really try to get to women themselves.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for breaking down what DAOs are and even just the state of research and getting research into industry. It's sometimes very convoluted. People are being trained to just see that this is the only way, but there is an alternative. And I'm glad that you are making it clearer for people so that they can either participate in AthenaDAO if this is a mission that they want to move forward, or the other DAOs that exist.
Yeah, there's one for Symbio, Valley DAO, Longevity, Vita DAO.
We interviewed Albert Annis.
Yes.
A few weeks ago. We're definitely big proponents of the DAO. We want to make sure people understand what they are and how to participate. But I do want to continue talking about AthenaDAO because it's just absolutely necessary. And you mentioned that there's a focus on reproductive longevity. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and why that's important?
So reproductive longevity basically has everything to do with fertility and menopause. It involves the reproductive life of a woman or journey. It is tied to ovarian life. It's a very important part for women's life, from when you get your period to the moment you decide to have children to the moment in which that journey ends and you go into menopause. It's super important because it really impacts women's health in different ways. It impacts women's decisions, women's lives, from the choice of maybe having children, maybe not having it. Right now, we have a societal problem, and it's not women's fault. It's just what it is, that we don't have as much wealth as previous generations. So people are not getting married as young. Women are also making different choices in their lives. They want to go and pursue their careers. By the time a woman could potentially be financially in the right place to have a child or have a partner in her mid-30s, technically by then your ovaries are quote unquote old. That's why they call it a geriatric pregnancy by 35, and you could be high risk. Biology is very tricky when it comes to women. Then there's a whole part there, and then you get to menopause. And menopause is an accelerated state of aging for women. We age about 6% faster during this period than a man at that point. The other part is that post-menopause, you come out with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. That's why more women suffer of it. Osteoporosis, bone density goes down. That factory of hormones that helped us through all those years, when it goes to zero, it's not a good time for women. And yes, it's natural, but dying at 30 was natural too. Not having vaccines was natural. Babies dying premature was natural. If that was natural and we fixed it, why can we actually work on things that impact our health? Women are living now longer than men. So that means that over a third of their life is postmenopausal. And that's compromised health of state for a lot of them. Not for everybody. The menopause journey is very different, but it's super important. So reproductive longevity touches on this because it's basically the research that is looking at how to extend fertility or how to potentially delay menopause or what can we do for better menopause management. Right now, the only solution is hormonal replacement therapy, HRT. Due to a study that happened 20 years ago, it's still very, very controversial. We haven't done more research, and this is incorrect because there's only one solution. And if we're not even coming to terms with that solution, then women, when they start this journey, they have zero education, depends where you live, which country in the world you live, depends what OBGYN you have, that you will have access to this treatment or not. It's such an important part of our journey, and it's shocking to me that we spend so little time researching it. And just for context so people understand, women make half of the population in the world. Even if you don't have a child, you will go through menopause. The NIH in 2022 spent $49 billion in research. Of that, only 10% went to female-specific conditions. And of that, 0.019 or something like that went to fertility, which is the area of ovarian aging. Something that impacts every woman in the world, half of the world's population, is getting next to zero funding. Again, the emoji with the brain exploding is where we go with this.
Yeah, I'll just say, and Karl, this is definitely something I know you're going to probably tap into, but it's also a male issue. It's a man's issue as well, because men need women to reproduce. Men come from women, and there are also effects on the baby when they're inside, when they're gestating. And if a woman is not receiving the care during pregnancy, that does affect the fetus. And if it's a male fetus or female fetus, it does affect them. So it's being able to share these stories and help people understand that women's health is health in general for the whole population.
Yeah, all the stuff that you said, Laura, is mind-blowing. We know that there is this disparity in research and women's health, but just the way that you summarized it, I thought was just so amazing. I just wanted to make one comment. You started at AthenaDAO just a couple months after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. How did that influence your thinking about AthenaDAO? And I know you're based in Canada, so it's a little different.
Well, what happened with that ruling then is just been a trend that we've seen over the past years of the erosion of the rights of women. We're going backwards. It's shocking that we talk about technological process, the whole AGI thing. We're going to have sentient beings very soon. And yet when it comes to women, we're like 50 years behind. There's a whole trend also on X, formerly known as Twitter, of fertility shaming, of saying that the reason we have a fertility crisis is because of women, that they need to go back to that 50s notion of stay-at-home moms. To me, it's shocking because that train has left the station. It's never going back.
Never coming back.
No, we're never coming back to that. The fact of the matter is there is a lot of women between the ages of 35 to 45 that would have children now if they had the capability to do it. And biology is not fair that way to women. So they struggle. But if we focused and actually make those dreams possible for those women, you would see a spike on fertility because those women would be ready to have those children even on their own. The fact of the matter is we don't have the technology. It's been 45 years of IVF. The improvements have been incremental and tiny. Why? Because in a way, IVF became a business, an industry. Now private equity owns IVF clinics. And some clinics give incentives for more treatments. And now this is not throwing an entire industry under the bus. is the reality in some places. The next generation of reproductive technologies is where the future lies. We do need to make these improvements because we're depopulating. It's real, the fertility crisis. The world is aging really fast, and longevity is bid out to really do that whole reversal. The world is an ecosystem that runs through a very fine balance. Once starts thing getting out of balance, it's all going to go haywire. In the DeSci London conference that you mentioned, even your moonshots of going to Mars will require things like the artificial womb. It's super important that we do these tech, as you said, not just for women. It's just for species survival. The other part is, I don't know how much of your audience is into sci-fi.
Yeah, they are.
Dune is super popular right now. And when you look into it, if you think of it, the Bene Gesserit are the brokers of the universe. And what do they focus on? I guess making sure that the bloodlines work. And what is that? I mean, they're calling it eugenics in some readings that you do about the thing. It's not really eugenics. It's really making sure that the bloodline is preserved. So it's reproductive life that is brokering the universe, not anything else, but literally making sure that they get to their like Messiah. It's a very crazy metaphor, but you see it also in Blade Runner. Blade Runner, the first one, is about longevity. So those new sentient beings, they want to live longer, and that's what they're fighting for. And Blade Runner 2, it's about the villain trying to figure out how to produce more of them. So that's reproductive technology. Basically, science fiction is constantly telling us that the only thing that will matter in the future is these technologies. So to me, it's like, well, you don't have to care about women's health. You just have to care about the future for you to be involved in this.
Yeah, you just mentioned Dune and Blade Runner and linked it to women's health. So you are best friends of ours.
I'm working on an essay about it because I'm obsessed about it in the sense that they're my favorite. Like Blade Runner has been my favorite movie up to now, Dune. And I've seen all the Dunes. I saw the David Lynch Dune. I read the book. I even saw the Alejandro Jodorowsky making of it. And I finally understand why he wanted to make a film about it, because I think it's one of the deepest allegories on technological progress that could be out there.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Yeah, it's wild. But yeah, you're a best friend. Both Blade Runners are my favorite movies. So you just got into how women's health research is underfunded. It faces so many stigmas and misconceptions. So now tell us, how does AthenaDAO address those challenges and promote awareness and understanding of women's health issues?
So our tagline is that we work on translation of women's health research, funding, education, and access. The interesting thing about the DAO and why we chose to be a DAO is because when we were going to have the first conversations with funds and with investors and with people in the space, they were like, well, why don't you just do a venture fund? Why don't you just do a research foundation? Those things already exist. Why do something else that already exists? And I think the most powerful thing about the DAO in addressing the issue is that you can bring the community into the fold. The first part that we addressed was the science. How do we get credibility in the research and scientific space? Obviously, the call for submissions involves reaching out to academic institutes, doing a lot of the convincing or explaining. They need to understand that they never touch the Web3 side of things, that for them, it's just they get US dollars. So that's the most important part. Second part is obviously being in constant conversation with the researchers that matter. We just had our AthenaDAO summit 2 weeks ago in Cascais. And it was very exciting because we brought researchers from Stanford, from the National University of Singapore, from Colorado University, all working in different areas of ovarian aging, clinicians and researchers. And they loved it. One, because they had never met each other, even though they work in the same space. Two, because they thought it was very valuable to bring the clinician and the researchers together. Because what a researcher thinks might work doesn't have real life application. Or the clinician would challenge because they say, well, when I'm with my patient, they're not going to X, Y, and Z. So one of our big things is trying to create a hub where these conversations can happen, where we're able to capitalize on the energy of new funding mechanisms to fund science that has been overlooked. So that is the funding part. But what I think is the most interesting part is the advocacy, because we're able to reach women. We have a very good community from our newsletter. I would say that in Web3, you measure your numbers by your Discord. And Discord is like a Slack, but for Web3. You have channels, conversations. It was started by gamers and then Web3 adopted it. But we really focus on the Web2. How do we reach out to women and things that matter to them? I love sci-fi, you heard here now, but that's not every woman. Women want to know what they need to do today. Cool, then maybe one day we're not going to have menopause, but how do I deal with my perimenopause today? So trying to make that advocacy, the connect between hard research biotech and what the needs of women are today, is where we really put a lot of dedication to it. Because it's very easy to talk between people that are into these novel technologies. But if you really want to reach a mass audience, you're going to have to figure out what that mass audience needs so you onboard them. The DAO is a very interesting mechanism because we're not in a silo in academia. We're also not in a silo in a research hub. We're also not a venture fund which focuses on the returns and speaking to the scientists or the founders. We're literally speaking to patients, to women, to people that this is going to touch. That's what I think is the most fun part of this type of organization.
Oh, yeah, that's so fascinating. I really hope that our listeners can really understand that there are other options, because we have people that are entrepreneurs, that are academic entrepreneurs or researchers, and always looking to get inspired and to see that there are alternatives to the status quo of raising venture funding, but to be able to do something that hits on the customer, hits on the funding, hits on the research all equally is just wonderful to consider, and that you're doing it. So this is your life. But I wanted to learn a little bit more about the research that's out there, to have a call for proposals. I know reproductive longevity is your initial focus, but women's health is multifaceted, although rarely discussed. When we talk about women's health, reproduction is the first thing you think of, but there's also, of course, other facets to women's health. Can you maybe elaborate on other areas of research that you have considered or AthenaDAO has supported or you've seen come through your call for proposals pipeline?
So we developed what we call a cohort approach to calling for submissions. And I went into reproductive longevity because that's when we kicked off. It was our very first one. That was our first cohort. We are in cohort 3 now. Cohort 2 was PCOS and endometriosis. Those areas of research are also massively underfunded and have a high impact potential. 1 in 10 women has endometriosis. That's a lot of women. PCOS also affects a lot of women. And I don't even want to tell you, but again, these areas get very little funding. Very hard for startups that work in endometriosis and PCOS to get funding, even though a lot of women suffer these conditions. Or the third one is on oncology. Oncology, if you're in biotech or in the medical industry, you know that gets the most funding in scientific research. You can go online where you can see where most of the scientific funding goes. Oncology is number 1, Alzheimer's is number 2. However, when we did our research, we found out that endometrial cancers and gynecological cancers still get the least funding, even though the patient population is quite high when you compare to other areas of cancer. Again, an issue. So we try to tackle areas of funding that are struggling in women's health. Even though people that work in fertility will tell you, oh, fertility has a lot of funding. No, it doesn't. Because if we had a lot of funding, PCOS and endometriosis, we would have sorted it out. Absolutely nothing in women's health has enough funding. So let's just make it very clear. There's no, oh, it's okay. Because there's an industry in IVF, it doesn't mean that we're funding research. There is a huge industry, but there isn't research being funded. Our approach is, as you said, women's health encompasses so many things that if you say we're doing women's health, people are like, well, that could be anything and everything. So by our cohort approach is we divide by condition or research area. We're number 3. We're very excited to go to number 4 in the summer, which is reproductive technologies, which is why at DeCi London, I spoke about artificial womb. IVG, I know we had that conversation. I let you know about that company Conception, that they're working on this, and other companies in the US that is the next generation of reproductive technologies. There's so much to do there. I know that, for instance, there's companies working in embryo testing, selection release, and I know that these are technologies that scare people, but these are also technologies that save humans from disease. And that's the most important part, that people need to realize it makes a huge impact in your life when you are living with disease yourself or your loved ones are. So if we can tackle that first, I think newspapers and magazines like clickbait. So the first thing they say, oh, you're going to be able to change your color and intelligence and whatever. No. How about if we can screen for things like mutations or potential really problematic diseases for the baby? Let's start with that. That's what it is about. Even an artificial womb, technically, an incubator, it's an artificial womb as it is. So it's just getting more sophisticated. We're also doing apparatuses and wearables this year. Next year, we want to do neurological diseases, heart disease, which impacts women now a lot, postmenopause, autoimmune diseases, which impacts women the most, more than men. There's a plethora of science to fund and areas to look at. It's just trying to get more funding faster. So that's how we look at it. We break it up in pieces and go piece by piece by piece by piece. Obviously, there's so much to tackle that we have a good 3-4 years of cohorts to approach in like different areas of research.
You started in 2022, you're up to cohort 3, about to launch cohort 4. Does that mean you're trying to do 2 cohorts a year? And that's funding cohorts. It's like a focus, and then these are the areas you're going to fund.
So we're trying to be more ambitious to get 4 cohorts a year. We're doing the cohorts in sprints on 4 and 5. Obviously, our first one, the reproductive longevity, took the longest because we had just formed. When we did our first call for submissions was November of 2022, so quite fast. But by the time we did the establish how we were going to work, which is submission period, review period, R&D partner period review, and then senior review, which goes out of the DAO, it took us a while to figure out how we were going to do that. So our first cohort was maybe 6 months. From then, we've become much more efficient. Now we're trying to break them by 5, and then we're trying to get to 4. So that the oncology right now is going to be running in parallel already with Reproductive. So this year we should be able to get 3 cohorts ahead. And in the first cohort, we had 3 assets that came out of it. And by assets, we mean IP NFTs. So these are contracts on the blockchain that represent sponsor research agreements. Research, one was an equity deal, and it's not an IP NFT because that's different. For PICOs, we have 2. One is just getting finalized. And then for our mandate is to get 2 to 3 per cohort or more. Obviously, we have to be mindful of our treasury. And to be honest with you, we see more opportunity of things to fund than the actual amount of capital that we have. So that's one thing that we have to accelerate. Even when we did the summit, the opportunity of the technologies that we could be bringing forth, if there was more funding, it would be incredible. But it takes us more time to convince the funders than other groups, to be honest. I don't know if it has to do with dealing with women's health, my being a woman. I don't know what everybody does take, even though we're the second biggest BioDAO after VitaDAO. We have the second most assets after them. We've grown our community the most. The other thing is that we could have had an exit, quote unquote, over the holidays if we had funded a project. An asset that we were funded from a lab in Switzerland got sold to an American biotech over the holidays. So that to me represents that we're doing really good due diligence, looking at science very thoroughly, and that the opportunity in women's health tenfold than in other areas of research.
It was an area that you guys funded. There was an exit. Did the DAO end up benefiting because of that, or is that part of the model?
No, because we delayed the funding over the holidays. It got so bad. If we had funded it, we would have been part of that exit. But yes, that's the whole point, that we would have had more coming to our treasury from that exit. I know people think, oh, it's a fail. No, it's a win. Because if we had put the money, that would have been our win. And yes, we didn't, but that's a function of circumstance. It just proves a lot of things. That this is an interesting mechanism to try to push science forward, that is community owned, that it's also community driven. It's very powerful when people who have been ignored or no one pays attention comes together to actually make things happen. I just want to say, because I came from the luxury and the beauty industry, Most of the biggest companies in the world that are huge beauty companies now came from will of women who did not find the products they wanted or were not treated the way they wanted to be treated that made them happen. Like Estee Lauder, Helena Rubinstein, very clear examples of women that you will make it happen for me, I'll make it happen. And that's where we are in this inflection point with this.
That's amazing. So just to understand, you're funding research only, or do you fund companies? And what do you look for in particular? So you said that there were a lot of call for proposals, a lot of applications. There were just so many to choose from. What is your criteria on deciding which to choose?
Let's speak about the first one, because that to us was proof of concept. When we first did the call for submissions, it did help that we came from the longevity industry. 3 of the 4 members had a connection to that world. So it made it go much faster. Won't deny that. But we had 80 applications in our first call for submissions. And we got people from Harvard, from Oxford, from NUS, very reputable academic institutes. That to us, it showed that there's a need for this. Secondly, that obviously there's a lot of science out there. What we look for is we're a regenerative system. We're not a venture capital firm, which you fund something, you expect returns, and it goes out to the LPs. We are a community owned. That's why I call it crowdsourcing, because the treasury that the DAO has is what is used to fund the science. We're looking for translational science. So that is the first important part. We're not a granting mechanism. There's amazing foundations out there. The GCR Alliance and at the Buck Institute, they fund questions of science. And that's super important. But that kind of foundational science requires millions and millions and millions. So it's great that government gives them grants. It's great that philanthropists can give them $100 million, because doing foundational questions of science, longitudinal studies, take millions, 10, 20 millions. We looked at a PCOS project, $5 million for a longitudinal study of 2 years. We don't have that kind of funding. What we're looking for is translational science that could end up being IP or something that could lead to something that it's an actual solution. Why? Because as the exit that I mentioned, quote unquote, is not an exit, we're not investing. Somewhere that creates a liquidity moment for us is having those returns to the DAO in the treasury so that we can fund more science. So it's regenerative. In that part, I understand why people might think it's like a venture fund, because you're wanting to have returns. But our returns is to actually fund more science and keep the cycle going, rather than just have the returns go back to the investors, which all of the DAOs also get support from investors, that they believe this is a new way of getting science and biomedical progress ahead, because it's a big experiment what we're doing. And you guys know from Symbio, it's so expensive to do science.
Yeah.
Our treasuries are like this. We were talking like it takes hundreds of millions of dollars. Our mission would be that one of these DAOs gets to a treasury of hundreds of millions of dollars to really accelerate progress and be able to say that from translational research funded from the DAO, it made it to a therapeutic with a patient. That's the dream. I know it's a grand vision. People that know science and funding, they're like, oh, this is so funny. But grand visions start with an idea, so you never know.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere. Suddenly, then all at once, or gradually, then suddenly, whatever the saying is. The whole thing is just amazing. I mean, are there any notable achievements or milestones besides this missed opportunity that you want to highlight, that you want our listeners to hear about?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'm very proud about is our alpha team, which we have about 40 to 50 contributors, active contributors. I mean, members is counted different as people that are on Discord or on your social media. At this stage, we're like a 9,000 members. But contributors, people that do stuff for the DAO on a weekly basis, is about 40 to 50. But our alpha team, which is a mix of the people that are working full-time, part-time, and I'm very committed, is 12. And of those 12, 8 are women in STEM.
Amazing.
From neuroscientist, a clinician, a PhD candidate in cardiovascular disease, and ovarian aging PhD. I am particularly proud about that because they are women in science. They are now in Web3. Some of them didn't even know what Web3 was about a year ago, and now they're in this ecosystem. So we've done really well on onboarding women into the space. The fact that we are such a strong team of basically researchers, women in science, is, I think, one of the biggest testaments to what we're building. in terms of the mission-driven approach, and that these women experience it on a daily basis in academia and industry, and knowing what it's like to try to raise money, get funding from grants, being in those labs, being the only woman in those labs. And their motivation is so big that we are able to do a lot because of it. And that to us is a huge, huge thing. Obviously, to us, the potential exit was a big moment. The fact that we're working with researchers. My dad is a geologist. He's a PhD and he wanted me to go into science. So me not going into science was his biggest moment. So now I was like, hey, Dad, I'm hanging out with researchers from Stanford.
And I'm giving them money. I'm funding their research.
I'm such a geek. I love it because I spent my career in fashion, but to me, nerding out with them and talking about these technologies and the fact that they give me the time of the day is my biggest thing. So I'm very proud about that. I made a complete pivot and I'm actually doing these conversations with these people.
Yeah. I think a big thing too is that you come from the world of direct-to-consumer communications. That's what we do from the day-to-day. We're not just professional podcasters, but we do have a job and on the comm side in biotech, and it needs it. They need you. They need you absolutely to advocate, to translate the science into how does it become a product? How does it get into the hands of people, especially women in this case? You should be very proud of the work that you're doing. It's just incredible.
I tell them, I'll hustle and sell for you. You just do the science.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. We'll hustle on the outside.
Yeah.
You do what you got to do. That's amazing. So I am curious about the research because you're in the Web3 world and there's another facet to be able to put research on chain and share research. Are you doing any of that? Is that something that's a part of the AthenaDAO? Is it not? Just to know a little bit more about that.
So the only thing we're putting on chain right now are the contracts.
Okay.
Because there's sponsor research agreements that go on the chain. And the reason you do this is because there's various interesting mechanisms in Web3 to once the milestones are made, you could potentially fractionalize the contracts so you get more funding so that people have a say and a play in this, where women, if we say, hey, this research could actually get us, let's say, this is very hypothetical, a new pill for menopause, they decide. And then we fractionalize those contracts and that is what happens. These are all new and they're also experiments. I know that in Web3, there's a lot of the conversation on data ownership, on making sure that you capitalize from your own data and all of these things. I think we're a long way out. For most people, data is an abstract concept. They don't even know what are we talking about here? Secondly, you cannot put data on the blockchain because if you're HIPAA compliant, you have the right to forget. How are you going to put your data on the blockchain when the blockchain always remembers?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's still a lot of things that we have to iron out. One of the big things that we're doing this summer for this kind of bull run that's going on in Web3 is we're doing our first pilot, I would call it direct-to-consumer project, which is one thing that I kept being asked from women, investors, funders, is like, oh, I want to freeze my eggs. I've been reading these papers. Do you think this is good supplements? So it's like, why don't we do a biohacking fertility type of thing in real time with researchers where we almost make it a preprint? And this is our big experiment that we can bring the community into it. Get data, see how we store it, really figure out all of these things. So we actually put something together that makes sense. It's a mix between Web 2 and Web 3. We're very cognizant of the potential of CK proofs, de-anonymizing data, synthetic data, all of these things. So how you actually make use of it, I think has to be very clearly outlined. I know there's a ton of protocols out there that is like, oh, you're going to get these things and tokens from putting your medical data. First of all, some places don't even allow you to grab your medical data. Even across the US, from one state to the next, the rules of data change. Who can access it? How you can walk around? First thing people need to figure out is how do I even go from one doctor and change to the next doctor and be able to get that data and make it make sense? In the 2000s, remember when you connected to the internet and you disconnected the phone and you would hear it would take hours to load your. We are at that stage in Web3. And when it comes to all of this stuff, and it's really cool because it's advancing really fast. But our first product that we're focusing on is actually a data platform, and we're tackling the ovarian aging side of things. So we brought on a data scientist, and we're going to look at one of the biggest issues in women's health, speaking of data, is data. From being siloed, from not having actually gotten hold of it, I laugh, and we were at this summit, and one of the clinicians and researchers made a comment that is very similar to what I say. We're talking about AI and drug discovery and how beautiful like AI is going to solve everything. What data is AI going to compute on and the algorithm if it's non-existent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Care delivery and all this discovery is going to exclude women by a big stretch because we don't have this data. The list is endless in what we can tackle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Getting people together, especially it's a part of the mission of the DAO. You mentioned you had contributors, and we're also almost at that time. So I want to make sure we get some call to actions in there. But I would love to first learn, when people are contributing, how are they contributing? Are you talking about the researchers that are funded, or can anyone contribute, and how can they?
Well, it's a call to action. If you're a researcher, if you're a developer, if you're interested in the next generation of reproductive technologies, join the DAO. There is the score there in the QR code, which is drop in, become a member. There you can say, I would like to join one of the working groups. The science and deal flow team is the one that deals with the research. And that's where we have PhD candidates, neuroscientists, geneticists, all sorts of science. You don't have to be an expert in women's health. My big call to action, because you have that kind of audience, is that there's so much to do in women's health. You literally don't have to be a researcher in women's health to join and find areas that could be very interesting. Think outside the box. If you're at a lab, if you're running a test, if you're like looking at ovaries just because you're doing a test, think, oh, maybe this could relate to women's health. There's so much opportunity because people are not paying attention to it. There is opportunity. That's the best word, that you build the best industries where no one is paying attention. Our disadvantage is our advantage. That's why we're dealing with such amazing researchers. That's why people come to work with us by the motivation. So a contributor, if you're in the science and deal flow team, you help us evaluate projects. You try to find scientists in the areas of research that we're looking for. We have other projects that we're now doing, the data one. So if you're in computational biology, please join us. There are so many verticals in women's health, as I mentioned, areas to tackle, that if you have an idea, it's a community that's open. I'm also very available. You'll find me on X a lot. I'm not on LinkedIn. If I don't reply on LinkedIn, it's because I really don't use it. But I'm on X, DM me. A lot of the science deal flow team. It's very easy to find the rest of the AthenaDAO teams. That's the interesting part, that if you have an idea, you can knock on the door and come and learn. If your thing is marketing communication, we have a community and awareness group for that. So there are so many different ways to contribute on a DAO according to your availability. We have people that are working at labs full time that also do a lot with us. It's just whatever you think matters, even speaking about us. Already having this to us, you guys are already contributors to the DAO because you're sharing this opportunity for us to speak. So anything and everything counts.
Oh, wow. And do we get tokens for that?
Maybe.
Oh. Got to get into Web 2, then get into the Web 3. Here we go.
Yes. So I'm glad that you brought the tokens. Our contributors get a token allocation every month. It is one of the incentives of Web 3. They also get, depending on some of the projects, because you can live off tokens that you live on a wallet, especially in the US. Disclaimer, we're very mindful of securities laws. We're very mindful of regulation. We have systems in place to try to avoid doing anything that comes out of that framework, because we're dealing with hard science. We're dealing with biotech. We want to be by the book until securities laws are properly defined. We're very mindful about those things. Even our US contributors, we hold their tokens in escrow in a way because we don't want to risk anything for them or anything that could make them seem like we're violating any of these securities laws. Hopefully in the next decade, they're going to make up their minds, and it is what it is, or it is what it isn't. But it seems like it's in constant flux.
Yeah, it totally is. Erum, did you have any other questions?
Oh my God, I have so many more questions.
I know. I feel like we could go on for like an hour, Laura. There's so much more.
Yeah.
I'm happy to come back another time. But, another thing that I wanted to say is that in the summertime, this biohacking project that we're doing is going to be NFTs, which now they know the regulation that is very clear. And it's another way for us to test going to consumer market, because even your grandmother knows what an NFT is. She's heard about it.
Yeah.
It's completely different. We're testing constantly. I think the exciting thing about DAOs is also the iteration process. It's much more modular and faster. With a startup, you have your team, you have your mandate, get to the next stage of growth. With us, it's like, okay, this working group can get this going faster, put a bit more emphasis on that, or having more ideas. And that's the exciting part of it. You guys are welcome to join our community awareness team.
Yeah. Sign me up. Yep. I'm going to do that right after this call because I'm just very fascinated. I'm going to a women's health event where I'm speaking on a panel. And I think I'll just be talking about AthenaDAO the whole time.
Oh, that'd
it's
be
actually later today.
amazing.
So this is great timing.
Are you paying attention to Oviva Therapeutics?
Of course. There's Oviva Therapeutics, there's Gamito, there's Somatics. They're the 3 big companies. All I say is that 3 companies is not going to cut it. We need to have 20 or more in the space. I also want to encourage people to find there's a ton of researchers that nobody knows about. There's a ton of companies. I think this is one of the issues sometimes in Silicon Valley is that because we have 3 big players, we think it's a done game and those are the only 3 big players. There's a ton of things going out there that we need to emphasize outside of that. So of course we know Daisy, Dina, there's the GCR League. There's like those big people that get a lot of playtime already.
Yeah.
And it's great. But 2-3 companies getting $60 million of funding is not enough. We need more.
Mm-hmm.
We need more scientific research funded.
Yeah, we need to get more of those conversations here on Grow Everything. Like we had reached out to Daisy because I've known her for a long time, but this area is just so fascinating. I want to keep talking about it and promoting it.
I can send you more researchers and startups and everything else, people that are doing really incredible things, even in things that is just not even just for menopause or fertility, but like the artificial womb and all these other things that we are going to need to survive as a species, not just because of women.
Yeah, survive and then also thrive and explore. I mean, if you're talking about interstellar colonization.
Yeah, to go to Mars.
Yeah.
You need that.
It's also very fascinating and it's a good exercise in thinking about how we can create technology. So thank you so much, Laura. It's been so amazing to talk to you. I'm sure we'll talk again very, very soon. Just that's been awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Enjoy your day. Thank you.
So Karl, what'd you think of the episode?
Laura is great. Laura's another example of someone who is not a scientist, who came into science. Mm-hmm. And she talked about her background working in luxury, working in marketing. She saw that there was a real need, as you mentioned in the intro, when it comes to women's health. I'm always surprised that women's health doesn't get as much attention as it should. You mentioned it also in the intro. We know so many incredible female founders. I'm so inspired by them. And while I know that healthcare or biopharma isn't necessarily a focus of Grow Everything, I think we should include more of them. I think Laura's a great example of the kind of people that we need more of on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. When we recorded the episode with Laura Minquini, that same day, I was invited to speak on a panel about women's health. So I came to that panel with all the insights that we all just listened to on this podcast. The audience was just floored and they were, I think, awoken to all of the needs. And this panel was at Fordham, the Gabelli School of Business. And what I found really interesting about this panel was that most of the audience were actually men, which for me was refreshing to see that. Because oftentimes when I've been to women's health panels or things that focus on women, it's mostly women. So I love to see that there was a lot of representation, and not just men and women, but everyone across the gender spectrum. I definitely need to hit up Laura for my AthenaDAO coins or tokens because we're definitely giving her a shout out. I have been just a big advocate on their approach to women's health and the specific things that they're focusing on in terms of reproductive longevity, which is really important, especially in today's modern society in the Western world of women working and wanting to delay having children. I feel like I'm one of those people. I had a child when I was 38. So I had a long time to first be by myself and then cultivate a marriage. I was married for almost 10 years before I had a child. We had a child. So, that I feel like, that was wonderful that I had that experience. So I loved it. I mean, I love what AthenaDAO is doing. I'm excited to see what other DAOs there are. She mentioned that there was a potential decision that they were going to get one company and didn't work out, but they were really close to picking that company, and that company ended up raising so much money. And there was a successful sign to her to see that they're onto something where they're rallying more women's health focused companies and projects and initiatives and bringing that together in a platform. So I love it.
There's a couple things. One is we ended this year's Symbio Beta with a talk about DeSci with this guy, Juan Benet, who has the same name as a very famous Spanish author, by the way. But one of the things that I find super fascinating about the DeSci movement is that it serves as an alternative funding mechanism to science. And there is this huge problem that science faces when it comes to commercializing science and turning research into actual commercial products. One of the things that really stood out for me with Laura was the fact that she's built this community around AthenaDAO. And that it just highlights again the importance of having a community for whatever you're doing. I mean, here we are. We've built this community in Brooklyn. We've built this online community with Grow Everything. But having that community to foster more innovation when it comes to women's health, I think is incredibly important. The other thing is that it seems American politics are going against women's rights and women's health. I feel like organizations like AthenaDAO are more important than ever. I love Laura, and I feel like we had just started to warm up when we were having the conversation, so we can definitely have her on again.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too with DeSci, which we'll dig into in a future episode, is not just the funding mechanisms, but having all of the data on chain and how that looks and how that can be shared. And it could be another place to put value on the data, not necessarily just on the cash that comes through. And we'll have our friend Mike Fisher break down how that works. But Laura Minquini is such a cool person. The fact that she was mentioning some of our favorite movies.
Yeah, she mentioned both Blade Runners and Dune. And I know a lot of people who have a problem with the second Blade Runner because it's very bold. And also, how can you make a sequel to such a brilliant movie, the Ridley Scott original Blade Runner? But the second one, directed by Denis Villeneuve, is an amazing visual treat. And both of those movies are definitely in my top 20 movies for sure. Blade Runner is definitely in my top 5. But she also mentioned Dune, which I was fascinated by her take on Dune. And she said that not only had she seen the David Lynch version of Dune, which is considered to be a failure by many, but also the Alex, I never remember how to say his last name. He's a Polish animator who was going to make a version of Dune, but never saw the light of day. So if you can go down that rabbit hole, it's super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So more rabbit holes to go down in our future episodes. And that's how we operate and make sure that we learn about what's going on in biology. And there's a lot to unpack. So beyond the Grow Everything podcast, we share other information, especially with our insiders. So for those that want to be on the inside, please join our Patreon community. Although I'm like, oh, should we do a DAO? But maybe some other time.
Maybe that's in the future.
Maybe that's in the future. Yeah. Well, yeah, let's see what happens in the future. So we'll see what happens. But please, this is your invitation to join. Anything else, Karl? Anything else you want to share?
No, I think that's it. I mean, that's the pod.
All right, everyone. Stay tuned.
See you later.